Good morning. All right. We're going to start with review this morning, so you can turn to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. When Daniel was thrown into the den of lions, what did the king say about Daniel's God? That's Daniel 6:16. Uh-huh. Yes, exactly. So the king is on Daniel's side. He's like, may your God save you. Great. And then the kings afterwards in Daniel 6:26, the king said that Daniel's God is living God, not dead, not never existed or anything like that. He acknowledged that Daniel's God was a living God. I'm not so sure if he probably thought he was one of many gods, but at least he acknowledged that Daniel's God was living and powerful. All right, now we're going to switch to Adam. All right. Why did Cain become angry? Genesis chapter 4. What happened?
God was more pleased with
Right. So more pleased with Abel's offering, but not happy with Cain's. And then God's like, well, if you do good, then you won't be upset, right? So, all right, now moving on to Enoch. Describe Enoch's relationship with God. I heard it. He walked with God. Somebody said it? Yes. Oh, okay. He walked with God. This is Bible trivia. This will help you in your Bible trivia games. The oldest man that we know of who lived? Methuselah. And then if you need bonus points, it is how long did he live? He lived 969 years. Wow. That's a long time. All right. Did Adam have more children besides Cain, Abel, and Seth? Yes. Yeah, exactly. But sometimes it's easy, if we don't talk about it, it's easy to kind of get locked into the ones that were mentioned and forget about the fact that, and we'll even see this in our discussion today in this chapter as we go over, that the Bible its intention is not to record everything for us, right? Like there's things it decides to leave out because God knew that wasn't important for the goal of the Bible, which is to bring us, in a relationship with Him, teach us about Jesus and what He's done. So some of those things, like we didn't need to know about all of Adam's children, right? So anyway, just a small example. Okay, now to Noah. All right, Noah is in Genesis chapter 6. He found favor in God's eyes. Who is going to be kept safe in the ark? This is Genesis 6, starting in verse 18. Who's going to be safe? Okay, so we've got Noah and his wife, and then Noah's 3 sons, and then their wives, right? So I think that gets us to a total of 8. All right. Anyone else in the ark? Animals. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Which then leads us to the other review questions. How many clean animals did God tell Noah to take? 7? 7 pairs, right? 7 pairs. And then the unclean, I think it was 1 pair. Yeah. Okay. How long did it rain? Yes. 40 days and 40 nights. And again, another good Bible trivia for your Bible trivia games. Who shut the door? God. All right, great. See, now we're all warmed up. We're ready to discuss Genesis chapter 8. So last week, Tom took over for me, filled in, and he talked to you guys about the flood. And so Genesis 8 is, okay, the flood has happened, and it starts off with, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. Did God forget about them? No. I find that's an interesting phrase. Evidently, this is used, from what I saw in some comments about this verse, this is used often when God is about ready to act on somebody's behalf that he's like had a covenant with or something. So he had a covenant with Noah and his family that, hey, you're going to be safe in the ark. And so basically this is the way that it's phrased, that, okay, God's ready now to continue the story, ready to act. And what does he do? What is God's action that he makes here in the first verse? Wind. Yes, Tom. He causes a wind to blow over the earth. And I think this basically is the start of the process of making the waters recede. Okay? So there's some interesting kind of, I don't know if you want to call it wordplay, or there's some similarities here to this verse and the wind. Well, see, this is getting outside my comfort zone, but the Hebrew word here for wind is very similar to the word over in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, which talks about, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So really all I want to point out here is that, and we'll see this more as we go through our discussion today, that there's a lot of parallel between after the flood and creation. There's a lot of, if we could like set them side by side, we would see like, that's interesting. That kind of lines up. Lydia loves in her math when she gets to, draw the lines and do the matching. So that's kind of what I'm envisioning here, is we'll see a lot of those similarities. So yes, this isn't necessarily the Spirit of God, but it does kind of make you think back to the beginning, I think, is what's happening. All right. Who all here has been on a cruise? Okay. All right. What was the longest, how long were you on the cruise ship? Just shout it out. A week, 7 days. Okay. How would you think your favorite cruise, would you like to be on a cruise for a year? Who's signing up? Who's signing up? Oh, there are some hands. Wow. See, I'm surprised. See, maybe I'm just not a sailor or something, but I think seven days was enough for me, and I was ready. Depending on how you count it, and this was something that I have missed, but depending on how you count it, Noah and his family were on the ark for a year. I didn't realize that. Like we always think, the floods, 40 days and 40 nights, it rained. Okay. And then we breeze over the fact that like they were on the ark for a long time. To me, anyway. Although those few that raised their hands over there, they're still having a great time. So, oh, okay. I'm pretty sure they had some tight rations to make it through the year. So yeah, if you're interested, my study Bible had like can just kind of hold it up. I don't know, it's kind of faint. But if you're interested, you can see me after. My study Bible had a neat way of like showing how long it took, and it was based on how old Noah was. So, it started off in Noah's 600th year was when the flood started, and then you can see like the month of how old he was, and then it goes through, and when it ends, it's like in his, the earth dried out, and Noah leaves the ark was in his 601st year. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting way to kind of see that. So if you want more info on that, you can see me afterwards, and you can see this interesting chart. All right. So I mentioned that because in verse 3, it talks about how that the waters are starting to recede from the earth. All right. So when starting in like the first part here of 8, Noah starts trying to figure out, okay, is the earth dry, right? And so he sends out, help me out, it's a dove first, right? Okay, dove first. Some place in there, raven first, then doves. Have you guys noticed how that he does this, and then God tells him, okay, you can leave the ark now? Have you guys noticed that? Like, there was nothing mentioned in there that said, like, why Noah started sending these birds out, but it did make me think when I was studying this, it didn't seem like Noah really needed to do that, because God was the one that decided, okay, Noah, it's safe, it's time, you can leave the ark. I wonder if we do that sometimes where, I guess, again, there wasn't anything that said that it was necessarily a wrong thing for Noah to do, but it was at least, extra work he didn't have to do. Like, do we do that? I wonder if we do that sometimes today, where we're doing things we don't necessarily have to do that God's going to take care of. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, again, it wasn't like God reprimanded Noah for that, but it does get me thinking, like, what are those things that we do that we're kind of adding to our to-do list that don't even need to be on there that, God's going to take care of? He's going to say, okay, you can leave the ark now. Anyway, this is something I noticed there. Any thoughts on that? Counterpoints?
Well, it says that Noah had already removed the top from the ark and could see that the ground was dry, like for a few days before God told him.
Right. I know. So maybe he was getting a little antsy. Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sending out like doves on both sides. It's like, all right, maybe we need to really be sure.
So they're floating for 7 months.
Mm-hmm.
Then the ark comes to rest, but there's still 3 more months sitting there. Is this thing over yet? And then it says 40 more days, that's getting us to about a year, but I can see why he can send it out.
Oh, agreed.
Is this over yet or not? It's almost like we've been with this.
Yeah.
Thing we've been going through for 2 years.
Yeah.
Amazing patience that they didn't just charge on out.
Yeah. That is a good point. And I like the parallel to the pandemic there. It would have taken a lot of patience. I'm not saying I wouldn't have done the same thing, obviously, sending it out. I might have even, picked one of the sons to walk out there and see how far the mud went up, okay, maybe not. But yeah, that is a good point. The patience that we see there, the way he deliberately kind of did some testing to see if it was safe. It's a good point.
God closed the door, God might have been the one that opened to let him out too.
Right.
It doesn't say that.
It does. The fact that it mentions at least that God said it was safe for them to leave, it makes you wonder if he didn't, pop the hatch and like, okay, let's go. All right. So, thinking back to those of us who've been on a cruise, what was the first thing you did when you got off the cruise? Okay, maybe for those of you that enjoyed the cruise, what was the first thing that you did? What's that? Wished for the next one. Okay. Do we, when things go well, do we have a tendency to forget God, to forget to thank God, to remember God when things are going well? I sure do. It's easy. You get in the groove. There's not those road bumps that are kind of nice reminders like, oh, I need to, thank God, or, really remember I'm not in control. Now, I know my parallel isn't very good. It wasn't your happy cruise. I imagine it was very turbulent in the ark. But the example here of how, going back to what you pointed out, Mark, was that there was some time where they were in the ark that the water had receded and they're just waiting for things to dry out. But yet Noah still remembered to thank God after they left the ark. He still remembered to give thanks to God, which for me is a great lesson I can take from Noah. Is after that delay, Noah didn't seem to have a short memory. He was able to remember at least, wow, God got me through all this destruction. And even with, that time where they're waiting for it to dry out, he remembered, I'm going to set up an altar and I'm going to sacrifice and thank God for his safety. Yes?
I don't know if this is off the subject a little bit, but I went into the dollar store on Saturday. I was gonna buy some gum, and the line was long, and there was this mother and daughter. They were older, and in their thing, they had a thing of laundry detergent and softener, thing of paper towels, and a cardboard thing of milk. And I was standing there, and I have to tell you, I just felt so lucky. I don't know their situation, if it was a bad situation, but I'm so grateful to the Lord, seriously, that He had given me what I have. I bought their groceries, because I know that I have help
Right.
where I am. And sometimes I need help, but, and that was the best feeling I ever had, because I feel so lucky
Right.
having the Lord, and if that's how Noah felt,
Right.
that's how the Lord makes us feel.
Right.
It's the most amazing feeling in the world.
Right. And if we let it, though, we can miss those situations that should soften our heart, and turn our heart to Thanksgiving. But if we're, yeah, I wonder if God, you do wonder if God gives us some of those, like I mentioned before, the hard times that remind us. I wonder if he gives us some of those, during the good times, and we're just not aware and notice that, like, oh, I should be thankful.
Wasn't being prejudiced with that, and then I think, oh, I hope I didn't. But what got me was the milk.
Right.
It was like, oh man, if I could just find a big
Yep.
thing of milk. I don't know.
Yeah.
And she hugged me and hugged me. No, it's okay.
Right.
It's all right.
Okay.
He had a lot to be thankful for.
Fair point. Fair point.
Like he lived.
He lived.
Yeah.
And everyone else is, and another part we're going to discuss about is that it wasn't, I mean, we got to remember how much this would have changed the way the earth had looked, right? I mean, how devastating a flood is. The floods we've seen, you know, think of the worst hurricane you've seen. Imagine that all over the world, right? So yeah.
Just a gruesome thought, but do you think that there were still like bodies around, or did God sink them all down into the mud? Or did Noah have?
Yeah. So just I would like to think, yeah. You know. So just a little side note, at our house we have this little guideline that we don't do any like doctor talk while we're eating. You know, it's like, all right, we'll talk about that after we're done eating. So, right, I know. But yes, so yeah, that's actually one of the verses, and we can go there now, which is just briefly. We'll cover this more later. But to your point, Jen, in Psalms 104, and I know it's poetry and we have to be careful, but the imagery here does, I think, fit with what would have happened after the flood. So Psalm 104, 5 through 9, talking about God. He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed to them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. So this section here in Psalms, I mean, that sounds like the flood, right? And so I think that, to your point, Jen, God did a lot of like readjusting to the earth, mountains, valleys. I think that's part of how he got the water to recede, is he's doing some changing. So I'd like to think that the bodies, got fixed with that. All right. So when Noah made this altar and sacrificed the animals, he chose the clean animals. As far as I know, the Bible didn't record, at least, any kind of instructions that God has given the people about what kind of sacrifices he likes, what are clean animals versus unclean animals. Somehow Noah knew, and I think this is, again, another example of how that the Bible doesn't necessarily record everything for us. I think it's fair to reason logically that God must have instructed Noah so he knew what he liked and that he should sacrifice the clean animals. And this is also another good example to us that when we worship and thank God and are just overwhelmed with his greatness and the care that he is, think about Noah, the care he's given Noah, it should cost us something. It cost Noah something. These were, the animals that are going to replenish the earth. And he took from those to show God his appreciation. And so that's something that I've been working on, is making sure that, when I think about love, one of my little things that I try to help really get love into a everyday kind of thing that I know what it actually means, is that if it's costing me something, if it's meaning that I'm like, and it can be even just like an inconvenience. Let's even just talk about that. Like, oh, that's inconvenient. Well, if I love that person, then that's going to get me through that inconvenience. Do you see what I'm saying? It's going to cost me something. It's going to, like when the kids need something, it's not when it's convenient for me, right? It's like they have impeccable timing. It's like really the opposite, right? It's like, oh, right now, really? So it's those kind of things, right? So that helps me, Elaine.
I always thought that true love is really doing what's best for the other.
Yes.
And not yourself.
Yes. And that gets to the point of
It's hard.
the inconvenience, or it's costing me something. It's better for them, not so much for me. So again, I think that this sacrifice that Noah is making is a little example of that kind of love, at least he's showing to God. Like, here's these animals that have made it. I'm going to take, one of each. I think it sounds like, right? One of the clean animals, and he sacrifices them. All right. And then at the end of Genesis 8, we kind of have like we think of the covenant that God makes later in chapter 9 with the rainbow, but here God is making another promise about how that he's not going to curse the ground because of man's evil heart. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature. And so he makes this promise here in verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So I think that's kind of an interesting pre-promise or whatever that we tend to focus on chapter 9, but here's a promise at the end of chapter 8 about how things are going to remain. May not always seem that way, but we do have that promise that we can trust that God is going to take care of us. All right, so now we're going to transition into lesson 45 and look at the promise that God makes, the covenant that God makes with man, with Noah, and really all of mankind here. And we're not going to cover all of chapter 9. It's the first part. So this is the section where I think I would like to, I'm going to start comparing how that things have changed after the flood. So for example, Genesis 9, 1 and 2. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Sounds a lot like when God created the world. Then notice verse 2. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens. Basically upon everything. And it will be into your hand they will be delivered. Notice how that here God is mentioning the fear will be on them. But in Genesis chapter 1, like verse 28, God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the animals. I don't know if this is an extension of the dominion. I kind of think that it's just building on how that we are to rule over, take care of the creation that God's given. And now God's adding in this fear to the animals so that we'll be safe, because as we'll see later, just right in the next verse, verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So I wonder if that's not a combination here, that it's almost like now that you can eat the animals, there's going to need to be a little bit of fear in the animals to make that all, work. So did you guys catch that? That it sounds like, based on the way this is worded, prior to the flood, we were vegetarians. Sure sounds that way. So again, this is another, I think, indicator of the drastic changes that occurred after the flood. So now we can eat animals, eat meat. And then I already read from Psalm 104. I think that there was, God did a lot of changing to the surface of the earth, to the earth itself. So things obviously were not the same. So I kind of like to think of this. I was trying to think of the word, how to describe this. It's not like God is doing creation again. He's not creating anything new. And it's not a reset because it doesn't go back to the way it was before the flood. It's a renovation. Ah, yes. He did a renovation. There it is. He did a renovation. He had to rip out all of the old carpet. No carpet, hardwood floors everywhere, right? So that's what he did on a global scale. So, but again, this still shows, I think, God's care for us, his love, and continuing that, in verse 6, it talks about whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So here God is setting some rules about, hey, you can't, murder, right? You can't murder. And the punishment for murder is death, right? Now, he doesn't go into details about, at least here, because we don't have the Levitical law yet. He doesn't go into any details about how you're going to, judge someone guilty or not, right? But he does at least set the framework of justice. And it's important to note that it's not, well, you kill my brother, I'm going to kill all your family. Right? It's setting limits, which I think, it was easy for me to overlook that. So again, here's God kind of seeing a potential issue and setting some limits and boundaries that we're not going to have this getting out of control. Because if you kill all my family, well, then I'm going to, destroy your entire city or something. And you can see back before the flood, like the example here that was given was with Lamech, right? Lamech's 70-fold vengeance or something. So we've got some balance. So, verse 11, God is establishing a covenant with you, talking to Noah and all of his descendants, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. As far as I understand it, this is the first mention of a covenant in the Bible. We know that God uses, this is consistent with a lot of covenants where there's a sign that goes with the covenant. And in this case, the sign is the rainbow. There's nothing here that would indicate that the rainbow had to be this isn't necessarily the first time that a rainbow has been seen. It doesn't have to be that way. It can just be that God is using the rainbow as the sign that I'm not going to, destroy the world again with a flood. Sometimes anyway, I've heard some discussions, I think people sometimes try to, figure out what the world was like before the flood and would try to, maybe go, in my opinion, maybe a little too far and say that there weren't rainbows before the flood, and so now this might be the first one. I don't know so much about that. But the important part to see here is that God makes the covenant. What makes it powerful is because it's who's making the covenant, God, so we can rest assured it's going to happen. And I don't know, I think it's kind of neat. Every time you see a rainbow, you can think about that, the reminder. All right, guys, we've got maybe a few minutes if you wanted to, anything we've covered today, if you had any comments, questions, discussion.
Was God making, saying that, with the killing of the man,
Uh-huh.
with now, somebody murders somebody and they don't
Mm-hmm.
have a
Mm-hmm.
death sentence?
Mm-hmm.
Is that is that yes or no? What that person has done is so horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Killing a child, raping a child, of course we want them just to die, but do we really? In the Christian,
Right. So some of the stuff I saw discussing this verse, the gentleman that was discussing it, I thought had a good point that yes, here we see, God has given us, authority, I guess, to execute judgment if somebody has been murdered. We're going to, see that justice has happened. But right. But then he also pointed out that now as Christians, to your point, we also have, in addition to this verse, verses about mercy and love. And so I think that, his point is that as Christians, maybe we need to make sure that we have a balanced approach, that we see, yes, we want justice, and yet we should also have room for mercy and love, right? Does that make sense? That we're not going to just be, yeah.
and there's been probably statistics that have given life to Jesus in jail. That's
Right.
sin,
Right.
and that's what we're done for.
Right. Exactly. So anyway, that's my best answer to that. All right. So just a heads up, for next week, we are making another one of those big shifts. We're not going to continue in Genesis. We're going to go to Job next. All right. So Job is next. Thank you guys for your attention, comments. Thank you. And I've got the bookmarks for the reading if you guys want them.